The padlock clicked shut at 9:47 a.m. I know the exact time because I was standing 6 feet away when Sandra Mott snapped it closed, turned around, and smiled at me. Behind me, 73 families, cots in a church parking lot. A tornado had ripped through Ridgecrest 14 hours earlier. Inside that fence, our relief depot, generators, tarps, water, chainsaws, 2 years of stockpiling for exactly this kind of day. Sandra adjusted her pearls, tucked her clipboard under her arm, and said, very crisply, very calmly, "This depot is out of compliance. I'm shutting it down." She drove away in her Lexus. I stood there in the gravel and the diesel smoke, listening to someone's kid crying 3 rows back in that parking lot. She thought shutting down that relief depot was the end of it. It was just the beginning, because what she was sitting on, right next door, I was about to take all of it. What would you do if an HOA Karen shut down your town's disaster relief? Drop where you're watching from, and stay with me. Let me back up about 4 years, because this story doesn't start with a tornado. It starts with a man, a patch of land, and a community that built something beautiful out of almost nothing. My name is Garrett Calloway. I'm a retired electrician out of Millhaven, a mid-sized town in central Tennessee. The kind of place where the Dollar General is the busiest building on Main Street, and everybody knows your truck by sound. I grew up there. My father grew up there. When my dad passed in 2018, he left me a 3.4-acre parcel on the east side of town that he'd been sitting on since the late 80s, waiting to do something with it someday. I did something with it. After talking with neighbors, with the pastor at New Covenant Church down the road, and with the local emergency management coordinator, a sharp woman named Deb Whitmore, who'd been fighting to get Millhaven better prepared for storms since the 2011 outbreak, we converted that land into a community relief depot. Think of it as a local emergency warehouse meets community garden meets tool library. We had a covered storage bay for emergency supplies, water, tarps, canned goods, generators. We had a half-acre of raised bed plots that local families could use year-round. We had a small equipment yard where you could borrow a pressure washer, a concrete mixer, a chainsaw, without needing to own one. We called it the Calloway Commons. Nothing fancy. A gravel lot, a 40-foot converted shipping container, some fence, some raised beds. Cost me about $22,000 of my own money, plus uncountable volunteer hours from about 30 regulars. The smell of that place on a Saturday morning, diesel from somebody's truck idling near the gate, wood mulch on the raised beds, somebody's thermos of bad coffee on the tailgate. That smell meant community. That was ours. Now, I want to be fair and describe where this land sat. About 2 years before I opened the Commons, the adjacent land to the north, a 6.4-acre parcel that had been a failed strip mall, got purchased by Millhaven's newest HOA development, Crestview Meadows. That's 112 townhomes, a tiny pool, and a clubhouse that looks like it was designed by someone who'd heard a description of luxury but never actually seen it. And with Crestview Meadows came Sandra Mott. Sandra wasn't originally from Millhaven. She'd moved up from outside of Nashville about 6 years back, retired early from some kind of pharmaceutical middle management, and immediately enrolled herself in every civic organization she could find. Not because she cared about those organizations, but because she could not tolerate existing in a space where she wasn't in charge of something. She was the HOA president within 8 months of moving in. She was on the town zoning board within 18 months. She had the kind of energy that's mistaken for competence right up until the moment you look closely at what's actually been built. The first time Sandra and I had a real conversation, she stood at my fence line, pearls, clipboard, reading glasses perched on her nose like a prop, and told me that the Calloway Commons was lowering property values and attracting the wrong element. I asked her what she meant by the wrong element. She looked at the volunteers working the raised beds, mostly working-class families, a lot of them Black and Latino residents from the East Side, and said, very crisply, "People who don't invest in this community the way Crestview residents do." I smiled. I thanked her for stopping by, and I went home and I started keeping a notebook. The notebook filled up fast. Sandra's first real move came about 6 weeks after that fence line conversation. I received a formal letter, not from the town, mind you, but from the Crestview Meadows HOA, citing a list of alleged code violations at the Calloway Commons, 7 of them, Everything from improper drainage adjacent to a residential zone to commercial operation in a mixed-use corridor without adequate screening. Now here's the thing about those violations. They weren't entirely made up. Some of them were the kind of technical gray area complaints that any property can attract if someone with enough free time and a zoning codebook decides to go hunting. The drainage issue was legitimately something I'd been meaning to address. Water pooled near the south fence line after heavy rain. The screening complaint was real-ish, too. There's a regulation about visual buffers between commercial use property and residential zones. And while the Commons wasn't legally a commercial operation, it was in a gray zone. But here's what told me everything I needed to know about Sandra's intentions. She didn't file these complaints with the town code enforcement office. She filed them with the zoning board, the board she herself sat on, and she CC'd 2 members of the county planning commission. She was trying to skip past the standard process and go straight to the people who could shut me down. I called Deb Whitmore that afternoon. Deb, who, bless her heart, had been navigating municipal bureaucracy since before Sandra Mott had even heard of Millhaven, told me to document everything, respond in writing to every single complaint, and under no circumstances acknowledge the HOA letter as carrying any official authority, because it didn't. An HOA has 0 jurisdiction over property it doesn't own. 0. Takeaway. An HOA can only enforce rules on its own member properties. If your land isn't in the HOA, their letters are legally worthless. So I wrote back, politely, formally. I addressed the letter to Sandra in her capacity as a private citizen, noted that I'd reviewed the Crestview Meadows CC and Rs, and confirmed my property was not subject to their covenants, and informed her that I was forwarding her list of concerns to the actual town code enforcement office for proper review, which I did immediately, before she could beat me there. I heard later from a friend at town hall that when Sandra found out I'd preemptively self-reported to code enforcement and requested a formal inspection, she stood in the hallway outside the planning office and said, with genuine fury, "He can't do that." He absolutely could do that. The inspection happened 2 weeks later. I fixed the drainage issue before the inspector arrived, rented a trenching machine, installed a basic French drain along the south perimeter, filled it in with gravel. Cost me $400 and a Saturday afternoon that smelled of wet clay and iron-rich Tennessee dirt. The inspector found nothing actionable, noted the drainage improvement in his report, and closed the complaints as resolved prior to inspection. Sandra escalated. Her next move was a zoning board meeting, a public one, which I didn't know was happening until Deb called me the day before. Sandra had added an agenda item, a petition to reclassify the Callaway Commons parcel as exclusively residential, which would effectively prohibit its use as a storage or distribution facility. She'd gathered signatures from 41 Crestview residents, most of whom, I'd bet my last socket wrench, had never once driven past the Commons. I showed up to that meeting. I brought Deb. I brought Pastor Elroy from New Covenant. I brought a woman named Connie Babbs who'd lost her roof in a windstorm 2 years prior and had lived on tarps and supplies from the Commons for 11 days while her insurance claim was processed. Connie spoke for about 4 minutes. I'm not going to paraphrase what she said because you won't believe me, but I will tell you that 2 of the zoning board members who weren't Sandra visibly teared up, and the reclassification petition died without coming to a formal vote. Sandra sat very still during Connie's testimony. Very, very still. The way a person gets still when they're recalibrating, not retreating. After the meeting, in the parking lot, she walked past me without speaking, but she paused, just briefly, and looked at the Commons through the chain link, and I saw something move across her face that wasn't anger. It was calculation. The crunch of her heels on the asphalt, as she walked to her Lexus, was the loudest sound in that parking lot. I updated my notebook when I got home. Sandra had apparently decided that if she couldn't beat me through code enforcement or the zoning board, she'd try a different angle. Money. Not bribing me. She wasn't that stupid, or at least not yet. What she did was start lobbying the county to deny the Commons its nonprofit exemption renewal. A little context here, because this is important. The Callaway Commons operated as a 501c3 charitable organization. That nonprofit status wasn't just about tax benefits. It was what allowed us to accept donated goods, apply for emergency preparedness grants, and critically, receive in-kind contributions from vendors who needed the write-off. If we lost the exemption, we'd owe back property taxes on the parcel, lose eligibility for 2 active grants totaling about $18,000, and potentially lose the donated inventory sitting in our shipping container. Sandra found an accountant, a guy named Vance Pitfield, who did work for several Crestview homeowners, and had him file a formal challenge with the Tennessee Department of Revenue, arguing that the Commons was functioning as a de facto commercial enterprise because we occasionally rented out the equipment yard for a nominal fee to offset maintenance costs. $35 a day for the pressure washer. That was the commercial enterprise. I want you to sit with that for a second. I found out about this challenge because one of the Department of Revenue clerks, who happened to be a cousin of one of my regular volunteers, gave me a heads up that a challenge had been filed, and I should probably get ahead of it. I called our organization's attorney, a woman named Faye Hendricks, who specialized in nonprofit law and had an office in Nashville. Faye had helped us set up the 501c3 in the first place. When I told her what was happening, she went quiet for a moment and then said, very calmly, "Garrett, I need you to get me every financial record you have from the last 3 years by Friday." I had them to her by Wednesday. 4 years of QuickBooks exports, donor records, grant documentation, volunteer hour logs, everything. Here's what Faye found when she went through our structure. We were, if anything, more compliant than the average small nonprofit. Our equipment rental revenue was properly categorized as related business income under IRS guidelines because it directly supported our charitable mission. We had documentation, we had minutes, we had a board of directors that actually met. We were, in the language of nonprofit law, squeaky clean. Takeaway: if you run a small community nonprofit, document everything. Board minutes, volunteer hours, income categorization, because a well-documented 501c3 is nearly challenge-proof. Faye submitted a response to the Revenue Department that was, and I say this with genuine admiration, a masterpiece of professional brutality. 42 pages, every citation footnoted. She didn't just defend us, she proactively demonstrated that the complaint itself appeared to have been filed without standing, potentially in bad faith. And she requested that the department note in its records that the challenge appeared to be connected to an ongoing dispute between the filer's clients and our organization. The challenge was dismissed in 6 weeks, but here's where Sandra's second move backfired in a way she hadn't anticipated. The Department of Revenue dismissal letter, which is a public document, noted that the complaint was found to be unsupported by the evidence presented. I filed a records request and got the full correspondence. Faye flagged something I'd have missed on my own. Vance Pitfield, Sandra's accountant, had submitted documentation in the challenge that included a map of our property, with measurements that were slightly off. Not enough to be an obvious fabrication, but wrong in a very specific way. Those measurements made our equipment yard appear roughly 15% larger than it actually was. Why would that matter? Because the threshold for commercial operation under state nonprofit rules has a square footage component when the income-producing activity involves physical space. If our equipment yard was the size Pitfield claimed it was, we might have been slightly over the threshold. At its actual size, we were comfortably under. Where did Pitfield get those measurements? He hadn't had access to our property. He hadn't commissioned a survey. The only recent measurement of our property layout had been done by the town's zoning department. During the inspection Sandra had triggered with her original code complaints, internal town records, which Sandra sat on the zoning board that oversaw. I added 3 new pages to my notebook that night. The coffee I poured to think it over went cold before I touched it. 11 months after that first fence line conversation, the tornado came. Not metaphorically. An actual EF2 tornado touched down 6 miles east of Millhaven on a Thursday evening in late April, cut a half-mile wide path through the Ridgecrest and Elmore Road communities, and was gone in 9 minutes. 47 homes seriously damaged, 11 destroyed. No fatalities. God was generous that night, but 73 families displaced or without functional shelter. This was exactly what the Commons was built for. By 6 a.m. Friday, we had the shipping container open, generators running, volunteers sorting supplies. Deb Whitmore had activated her emergency contacts. Pastor Elroy's congregation showed up with 2 pickup trucks and a flatbed. The raised beds became a staging area. The equipment yard became a tool distribution point. By 10 a.m., we had chainsaws, tarps, and work crews heading to Ridgecrest. The commons hummed. It smelled of generator exhaust and pine sap from the fresh-cut wood debris, and there was something almost electric in the air. The particular energy of people who know exactly what they're supposed to be doing, and are doing it. Sandra showed up at 11:30 a.m., not with supplies, not with a casserole, with a clipboard and 2 men I didn't recognize. Later learned they were from a private zoning compliance firm she'd hired out of pocket. She stood at the fence line and informed me, loudly enough for a dozen volunteers to hear, that the Callaway Commons was in violation of a recently updated Millhaven Municipal Ordinance, Ordinance 2021-14, amended the previous fall, which required any facility operating as an emergency distribution point to carry a specific category of commercial liability insurance and to file an emergency activation notice with the town clerk's office at least 72 hours before activation. 72 hours for a tornado. I'm going to pause here and tell you that the temperature in my chest when she said that was somewhere around the surface of the sun. People need help right now, I told her. Today. I understand that, she said, adjusting her reading glasses. But the ordinance is clear. She had her compliance guys photograph everything. They spent 40 minutes walking the perimeter, documenting. Sandra filed an emergency injunction request with the county court that same afternoon, seeking an order to close the Commons relief operations, pending compliance review. We got served at 4:47 p.m. Now, I want to give you the part of this story that makes me proud, because it's important. The judge who received that injunction request was a man named Judge Dale Pruitt, and Judge Pruitt, as it happened, had grown up on Elmore Road. He knew what that neighborhood looked like. He'd been on the bench for 19 years, and he'd seen a lot of things. But I imagine he'd never seen anyone try to shut down a tornado relief operation over insurance paperwork, while the debris was still smoking. He denied the injunction in 2 hours. In his written denial, 1 paragraph, blunt as a hammer, he noted that the ordinance Sandra cited included an explicit exception for operations responding to a declared state of emergency, and that the county had issued an emergency declaration at 8 p.m. the previous evening. She hadn't read the whole ordinance. Or she had, and she hoped I hadn't. Takeaway. When fighting any ordinance-based shutdown, always request the full text. Exception clauses are buried in subsections, and they're often exactly what saves you. The relief operations ran for 4 days. We distributed nearly $12,000 worth of supplies, deployed equipment to 34 properties, and helped coordinate temporary housing for 8 families through Deb's emergency network. Local TV came on day 2, not because we called them, but because a Ridgecrest resident named Bobby Fry posted a video of us that got 6,000 shares overnight. Bobby's video also captured, briefly, Sandra's compliance team doing their documentation walk at the fence line while volunteers were loading chainsaws into trucks behind them. The contrast was not flattering to Sandra. The comments on that video were a kind of beautiful disaster. Sandra sent me a formal letter 3 days after the tornado operations wrapped, citing ongoing compliance concerns and I want you to really hear this, requesting that I provide her with 90 days advance notice before opening the Commons for any future mass gathering or distribution event. I had that letter framed. It hangs in the Commons storage bay to this day. And I'll be honest with you, it was that letter, that specific, absurd, pearl-clutching letter, that made me start thinking bigger. Not just about defending the Commons, about what Sandra Mott was actually sitting on, right next door to me. Here's what I should tell you about the parcel directly north of the Commons, the 4 acres that used to be the failed strip mall and now form the south boundary of Crestview Meadows. I'd always assumed Crestview owned it clean, but after the tornado letter, while I was sitting at my kitchen table at about 11 p.m., with my notebook and a bourbon I wasn't really drinking, I started pulling the public property records for that parcel, partly out of anger, partly out of the electrician's instinct that when something's causing problems, you follow the wire back to the source. What I found took me 3 evenings to fully understand. The 6.4 acre parcel, which I'll call the buffer lot because that's functionally what it was, a wide band of land between Crestview's townhomes and the Commons, was not owned by Crestview Meadows HOA. It was owned by a holding company called Crestview Development Partners LLC, which was the original developer of the Crestview townhomes. That developer had sold off the townhome units 4 years ago, but they'd retained the buffer lot separately, probably intending to develop it later. And here's where it gets interesting. When the developer sold the townhomes to individual buyers and transferred the common areas to the HOA, they had recorded a deed restriction on the buffer lot that gave the Crestview Meadows HOA certain protective rights over that parcel. Essentially, the HOA had the right to veto any commercial development of the buffer lot that they deemed incompatible with residential character. Sandra, as HOA president, had those veto rights in her pocket. But then I found the tax records. Crestview Development Partners, LLC, had been delinquent on property taxes for the buffer lot for 2 consecutive years, not by a little. They owed $34,800 in back taxes, penalties, and interest to the county. And under Tennessee law, when a property owner goes 2 years delinquent on property taxes, the county can initiate a tax sale, a public auction of the property to satisfy the debt. The county had, in fact, initiated that process. There was a notice of tax sale filed in the county records 6 months prior. I stared at that document for a long time. Then I called Faye Hendricks. Faye confirmed what I thought I was reading. The buffer lot was heading toward a tax sale. If no one redeemed the taxes, meaning if Crestview Development Partners didn't pay up, the county would auction it. And here's the legal kicker that Faye explained very slowly and clearly so I wouldn't miss it. The HOA's protective rights over that parcel, Sandra's veto power over its development, were tied to the deed, which would transfer to the winning bidder at tax sale. But those rights only applied to commercial development. A buyer who purchased for non-commercial, community benefit purposes would have virtually no restriction on use. Takeaway. Tax sale auctions are public, often poorly attended, and can offer legitimate access to distressed properties, including ones with deed restrictions that don't apply to your intended use. Faye, I said, how much cash do I have to have on hand to bid at a tax sale in Tennessee? She told me. I looked at my savings account. I called my brother-in-law Wade, who'd been a commercial real estate broker in Knoxville for 15 years, and owed me a favor involving a very bad decision he'd made involving a pontoon boat that I had helped him hide from his wife. Wade, I said, I need to have a real conversation with you. The next 8 weeks were the most methodical 8 weeks of my life. I am, by trade, an electrician, a man who understands that the difference between a working circuit and a fire is how carefully you do the work you can't see. This was the same principle, just with lawyers and county assessors instead of wire and breaker panels. Wade drove up from Knoxville on a Saturday, and we spent 4 hours on my back porch going through the parcel records, the tax delinquency documentation, and the HOA deed restrictions. He had a yellow legal pad, and he wrote in the margins faster than I could talk. By the end of the afternoon, he'd drawn a timeline on the back page. The expected tax sale auction date, the redemption deadline for the delinquent owner, the filing window for interested bidders, and the post-sale challenge period. The auction was scheduled for 11 weeks out. Wade's first piece of advice: don't tell anyone outside our circle what we were planning. Not because it was secret, exactly. Tax sales are public. But because if word got back to Sandra or to Crestview Development Partners, they might scramble to pay off the delinquency and yank the parcel out of reach. The redemption window was open right up until the hammer came down. His second piece of advice: get a title search done immediately, before we went any further. I hired a title company out of Nashville. Wade had a contact there, and within 10 days, I had a full title report on the buffer lot. The news was good, mostly. There was one lien beyond the tax debt, a small contractor's lien from a fencing company that had done work on the parcel 2 years prior, about $3,400. Manageable. Faye confirmed that in a tax sale, most liens are extinguished. They don't follow the property, they become a claim against the former owner. The county keeps what covers the taxes. Junior lien holders generally have to chase the former owner for the rest. Takeaway. In most tax sale states, the buyer takes the property free of most prior liens. The tax debt is the price of a clean slate. While Wade worked the financial angle, I was working the use plan angle. Because buying a vacant 6.4-acre lot next to a community relief depot doesn't mean anything if you don't have a real plan for the land. I knew that walking into that auction as the neighbor who wanted to stick it to Sandra Mott was the wrong frame, legally, practically, and publicly. I needed a plan that was genuinely good for Millhaven, so I called Deb Whitmore and I laid out what I was considering. Deb's reaction was a long silence followed by, "You realize this would solve 5 problems I've been trying to solve for 8 years." The plan we built together over the following 3 weeks was this: purchase the buffer lot at tax sale, combine it with the existing commons parcel to create a 9.8-acre Millhaven Community Resilience Center. Phase 1, an expanded emergency supply depot with a proper vehicle bay large enough for the county's emergency management equipment, something Deb had been trying to find a home for since 2017. Phase 2, expanded raised bed gardens with a small greenhouse, managed by the same volunteer collective. Phase 3, and this was Wade's idea and I loved him for it, a community events lawn in the northwest corner, far from Crestview, where the space between the commons and the buffer lot was essentially dead land. Events, farmers markets, maybe a summer concert series, nothing commercial, all community benefit, perfectly clear of the HOA's deed restriction veto. The cranes. I can see you wondering about the cranes. I'll get to the cranes. But the cranes required one more conversation first. I drove to the county assessor's office on a Tuesday afternoon and spent 2 hours with a man named Phil Greer, who had been the county assessor for 22 years and knew every parcel in the county the way some men know every car in their driveway. I explained what I was planning. Phil pulled up the parcel records on his screen and leaned back in his chair and said, "Son, I've been waiting for someone to do something sensible with that lot for 4 years." Phil confirmed the auction details. He also told me, quietly, that the opening bid would be set at the total tax delinquency, plus auction fees, about $36,400 all in. He estimated, based on the condition of the lot and the current market for undeveloped land in that corridor, that there'd be minimal competition unless a developer caught wind of it. There was still a chance Crestview Development Partners could redeem before the auction. I prepared for that. I had Faye draft a formal notification of my bidding intent, a document that has no legal standing, but signals clearly to the delinquent owner that a bidder is coming. And we mailed it to their registered agent. No response. The cranes were already reserved. Somewhere between the title search and the auction date, Sandra found out something was happening. I don't know exactly how. My best guess is that the title company inquiry, while not legally required to be disclosed, showed up as a third-party records pull on the parcel's activity log, which is visible to the property owner. Crestview Development Partners may have mentioned it to Sandra, or someone at the county assessor's office talked. Small towns have small walls. What I do know is that about 5 weeks before the auction, 3 things happened in quick succession that had Sandra's fingerprints all over them. First, I received a certified letter from the Millhaven Planning and Zoning Department, not Sandra's zoning board, but the actual professional planning staff, informing me that a formal complaint had been submitted, alleging that the Callaway Commons was operating a habitual public assembly without a proper special use permit. The complaint cited the tornado relief operations, 2 community work days, and a volunteer appreciation cookout we'd held in September. A cookout. The planning department's letter was polite and factual. They were required to notify me of the complaint and give me 30 days to respond. This wasn't an immediate threat, but it was designed to eat my time and my attorney's time and generate enough official-looking paper to make a casual observer think I was under serious regulatory pressure. I responded within 10 days. Faye helped me draft a comprehensive response that documented the legal basis for each activity and included a legal analysis showing that our 501c3 status and the nature of our activities placed us squarely within the exemptions for community benefit organizations under the state's special use permit framework. We also included, not incidentally, a timeline of every prior complaint Sandra had made or been associated with, and we CC'd the complaint to the Tennessee Office of Open Government, just to put a flag in the ground. Second, someone posted a series of negative reviews on the Commons Google business profile. 3 reviews in 4 days, from accounts with no review history, claiming we'd damaged their property with equipment we'd lent them, and that we'd been rude and exclusionary. These were fabricated. We had no record of complaints from any of the claimed dates. But fake reviews are a known harassment tactic, and they're genuinely annoying because platforms take weeks to investigate. I screenshot everything, filed platform disputes, and, this was Wade's idea, posted a calm, detailed response to each review that was so clearly reasonable and well documented that the reviews ended up looking worse for the poster than for us. Within 2 weeks, 5 actual Commons users had posted glowing counter reviews, unprompted, and our rating went up. Third, and this one I took most seriously, I was approached outside the Commons one afternoon by a man named Darren Stroud, who introduced himself as a representative of a Nashville-based real estate investment group. He told me, very pleasantly, that his group had become aware of my interest in the buffer lot and wanted to discuss a collaborative arrangement. He suggested that if I stepped back from the tax sale, his group would purchase the lot and develop it as a mixed-use commercial space, and they'd reserve a small corner parcel, maybe half an acre, for my use as an expanded commons. Half an acre, out of 6.4, and in exchange, I'd give up my claim to the auction. I asked Darren who his group's investors were. He gave me 2 names. I wrote them down. Later, Wade ran them through his real estate network and confirmed what I suspected. One of the 2 investors was a Crestview Meadows resident, Sandra's neighborhood, her network. She was trying to buy me out through a proxy. I told Darren I'd think about it and get back to him. I didn't get back to him. What I did instead was call a reporter named Liz Faraday at the Millhaven Courier, the only print paper we still had, and suggest that she might find it interesting to do a piece on community land trusts and how tax sale auctions could be used for public benefit. I didn't mention Sandra. I didn't mention the auction. I just planted the idea. Liz ran a feature the following Tuesday titled, "Who Buys Distressed Land and Who Benefits?" It quoted Deb Whitmore. It quoted Pastor Elroy. It described, in general terms, how underattended tax auctions often result in community land being absorbed by investors rather than community organizations. The subtext was a brick wall. 2 days after that article ran, I got a call from the Millhaven Community Foundation asking if they could potentially co-sponsor our auction bid. Sandra had been trying to isolate me. Instead, she'd handed me a newspaper story that rallied an entire funding network. With 4 weeks to the auction, Sandra shifted from trying to stop me to trying to discredit me. And this is where she made her most serious mistake. She called a town hall. Officially, it was a Crestview Meadows community meeting, technically a private HOA meeting, but Sandra had distributed flyers throughout the surrounding neighborhoods, inviting the broader community to attend a discussion about the future of East Millhaven land use. She'd reserved the VFW hall downtown, 70-some seats. She'd arranged for a representative from the County Planning Commission to speak. I think her plan was to use the town hall as a platform to paint the Commons, and by extension me, as a nuisance operation, building the public narrative that her opposition to us was principled community stewardship rather than personal vendetta. She wanted witnesses. She wanted a record. She wanted the Planning Commission guy there so it looked official. What she didn't account for, flyers go everywhere. Deb Whitmore got a flyer. Bobby Fry, the Ridgecrest resident who'd posted the tornado video, got a flyer. Connie Babbs, who'd spoken at the zoning board meeting, got a flyer. Liz Faraday from the Courier got a flyer. And because Liz had just run her land use feature, she brought a notebook and a photographer. 104 people showed up for a 70-seat hall. I watched the moment Sandra walked in and saw the room. She'd expected 50 Crestview homeowners and a planning commission bureaucrat. Instead, she had folding chairs in the back, standees along the walls, a newspaper photographer, and a crowd that included half the faces from the tornado relief effort. The meeting did not go the way Sandra had scripted it. She opened with prepared remarks about responsible land stewardship and preserving neighborhood character, which landed with all the warmth of an HOA newsletter in a room full of people who remembered chainsaws and tarps, and who'd watched a woman in pearls try to shut that down. When she opened the floor, the room went in a direction she could not recover from. Bobby Fry stood up first and described, quietly and specifically, what the Commons had meant to his family in the days after the tornado. No drama, just facts. His voice was steady in a way that was louder than anger. then Connie Babs, then a man I'd never met, older gentleman, Vietnam vet's hat, who said he'd been using the Commons equipment yard for 3 years, and that it was the reason he'd been able to fix his own roof at 74 years old instead of going into debt. The Planning Commission representative, to his credit, sat very still and did not say anything that helped Sandra. When she tried to redirect to regulatory concerns, the special use permit complaint, the insurance issues, Faye Hendricks, who was sitting in the back row and whom Sandra had not noticed until that moment, raised her hand and methodically answered every specific legal claim Sandra made, not aggressively, just accurately, with citations. Sandra's voice got tighter as the evening went on. Her composure, which was genuinely impressive, started showing fractures. At one point she said, gesturing toward me, "Mr. Calloway has made this personal." And I said, very calmly, from my folding chair in the third row, "Sandra, you tried to close a tornado relief depot. I think the people in this room have decided what's personal." The room was quiet for about 2 seconds. Then it was not quiet. The Planning Commission rep left early. Liz Faraday filled 3 pages of notes. The headline the next morning, "Community rallies around Commons as HOA battle heats up before land auction." Sandra went home and, according to a Crestview resident who attended and later told me this with visible satisfaction, called an emergency HOA board meeting at 10 p.m. that same night. By the time that meeting ended, 2 of the board's 5 members had resigned. She was losing her base, and she still didn't know about the cranes. Here's why I'd reserved the cranes. 2 40-ton hydraulic cranes from a Knoxville equipment rental company, reserved for the week following the auction. The buffer lot had a derelict 3,200 square foot concrete slab on its western edge, the foundation of the old strip mall anchor store. Clearing it by hand or with small equipment would take weeks. 2 cranes and a demo crew could have it out in 2 days. It was efficient, but it was also, I'll be honest, a statement. When those cranes rolled down Elmore Road, you'd know something was happening, something permanent. Tax sale auction day arrived on a Tuesday in late October, under a sky the flat gray of old concrete, with the smell of wood smoke from somebody's fireplace drifting through the county courthouse parking lot. The auction was held in the county's administrative meeting room, a beige rectangle of a space with fluorescent lighting and plastic chairs that smelled faintly of industrial cleaning solution and old carpet. These rooms always smell like low stakes. This one was not low stakes. I arrived with Wade, Faye, and Deb Whitmore. The Millhaven Community Foundation had agreed to co-sponsor, which meant we had pooled enough capital to bid confidently up to $70,000 if we needed to. I was hoping we wouldn't need to get close to that. There were 6 registered bidders in the room. Wade had done quiet reconnaissance in the days prior. 3 of the 6, he believed, were representatives of the investment group that had approached me through Darren Stroud, Sandra's proxy network. 2 were individual speculators who routinely attended county auctions as opportunists, unlikely to run the price high. 1 was me. I looked around the room for Sandra. She wasn't there. HOA presidents don't attend county tax auctions personally. That's what proxies are for. The auctioneer opened the buffer lot at $36,400. The investment group came in at $38,000. I bid $42,000. They went to $47,000. Here's the thing about proxy bidders in a room where their client isn't present. They have a ceiling they were told not to cross. They're not emotionally invested. They're executing instructions on a spreadsheet. When the room goes quiet and someone looks at them like they're going to be there all day, they have a threshold and they fold at it. I know this because Wade told me, and Wade has sat in more of these rooms than I've eaten meals. I bid $52,000. The investment group counter at $54,000. I looked at Wade. He gave me a very small nod. I bid $63,000. The investment group conferred. 2 of the 3 proxies literally turned away and had a whispered conversation, and then sat back, said nothing. The auctioneer called it 3 times. The hammer came down. 6.4 acres, buffer lot, Calloway Commons expansion, ours. I shook hands with Wade, Faye, and Deb. Deb was trying very hard not to cry and was not entirely successful. Wade pumped his fist once, like a man who'd bet on the right horse and was keeping it dignified. I paid the fees, signed the transfer documents, and walked out of that beige room into the gray October air, and stood in the parking lot for a moment with my hands in my jacket pockets, breathing in the wood smoke and the cold, and the particular sensation of a circuit finally closed. The cranes arrived Thursday morning. I want to tell you what that looked like, because this is the part I replay. Two 40-ton hydraulic cranes rolling down Elmore Road at 7 a.m., boom arms folded for transport, the deep diesel rumble of their engines reverberating off the ranch houses on both sides of the street, the demolition crew behind them, 6 men in high-vis vests, a small excavator on a flatbed trailer, gravel crunching under pneumatic tires, the smell of diesel exhaust hanging in the cool air like a announcement. People came out of their houses. Bobby Fry stood on his porch in a bathrobe with his coffee. A woman down the block actually started clapping. A kid who couldn't have been more than 8 years old stood at the edge of his driveway, watching those cranes with his mouth open, like he was watching a parade float. I was standing at the fence line of the Commons when Sandra's Lexus pulled slowly to a stop across the street. She sat in the car for a long time. Then she got out. She was in her blazer, no clipboard. First time I'd ever seen her without it. She walked toward me, and when she got close enough to talk, she looked at the cranes and then at me and said, quietly, "What are you doing?" "Expanding the Commons," I said. "You can't. That land is tax sale closed Tuesday," I said. "Public record. You can look it up." She looked at the cranes again, at the demo crew setting up around the old slab, at the small crowd of Elmore Road residents who had materialized along the fence line to watch. Liz Faraday stepped forward from that crowd with a notebook and a recorder. "Ms. Mott, do you have a comment for the Courier?" The look on Sandra's face in that moment, the exact moment she understood that this was over, that the cranes were real, that the land was gone, that there was a reporter and a crowd and 2 cranes, and she was standing on a public street with no clipboard and no leverage. That look is not something I'll ever forget. She got back in her Lexus. She didn't comment for the Courier. Within 3 months, Sandra Mott had resigned from the Crestview Meadows HOA board and from the town zoning board. The Millhaven Courier ran a longer investigative feature, prompted by everything Faye had documented, examining whether Sandra's zoning board position had been improperly used to benefit Crestview property values at the expense of neighboring non-HOA residents. The state ethics office opened a preliminary inquiry. The pearls and the clipboard were retired. The cranes finished their work in 2 days. The old slab came out in pieces, loaded onto trucks, hauled to a concrete recycler in Cookville, where it became aggregate for a road project, which I found poetically correct, the old strip mall foundation becoming the base of something people actually travel on. The excavator graded the cleared section smooth, and by the following weekend, volunteers were already walking the new combined property, measuring and planning. The Millhaven Community Resilience Center opened the following spring. It's 9.8 acres now. The original Commons shipping container has been joined by a proper prefab storage building, donated through a grant Deb had been waiting years to land from the Tennessee Emergency Management Agency. Deb finally got her equipment bay, a covered structure large enough to shelter the county's emergency trailer and the 2 utility vehicles the county had acquired post-tornado. First time in Millhaven's history that emergency management has a permanent home. The raised beds expanded to a full acre, 32 plots, waitlisted 6 months out, tended by families from every part of Millhaven. On a Saturday morning in August, with the smell of tomato vines and creek water and somebody's pulled pork on a portable grill drifting across the property, it is one of the best places I've ever been. The community events lawn hosts the Millhaven Summer Festival every July. 3 days, local bands, food vendors, a 5K that benefits the volunteer fire department. First year attendance, about 800 people. Second year, over 1,400. And the northwest corner, that dead zone between the old Commons and the buffer lot, the one that used to be basically a gravel wasteland against Sandra's fence line. That's now the Callaway Whitmore Scholarship Garden, named for Deb's insistence, not mine. Half the beds are tended by high school students in an agricultural science program we partnered with the county school system to create. The produce goes to 2 local food pantries. The labor hours count towards scholarship points. We've given out 4 $1,500 scholarships in 2 years to graduating seniors who contributed to the program. Connie Babbs runs the scholarship committee. She takes that clipboard very seriously. The ethics inquiry into Sandra Mott's use of her zoning board position resulted in a formal censure letter and a requirement that she complete an ethics training course. It's not prison. It's not a fine. I'm not going to tell you it's justice in the Hollywood sense, but it's a public record. It's her name on a finding. And it means the next person who sits in that zoning board chair will know that the chair has teeth, and that someone, somewhere, will track what they do with it. I still have the notebook. I've started a second one. Faye Hendricks has 2 new clients in similar situations. Small community nonprofits being harassed by HOA boards that overreach their authority. She told me our case gave her a template. I told her she could use it. Wade came up for the first summer festival with his wife and his kids, and he stood in the middle of that event's lawn eating a corn dog and watching a local bluegrass band and looked at me and said, "Garrett, this is the best thing I've ever helped with." Coming from a man who's helped finance 17 commercial real estate deals, I'll take that.